I held the will in my shaking hands, reading the words that would haunt me forever. To my daughter Abigail, I leave nothing, as she has shown no interest in family. 23 years I'd been Dad's caregiver. My brother Mason visited twice a year. And somehow, he convinced our dying father that I was the one who didn't care. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most, this story is going to be different. Hit that like button if you believe in justice, and subscribe, because we're diving deep into what happens when family becomes your worst enemy. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, 3 years ago when Dad's Alzheimer's started getting bad. I'd been living in Portland, building my marketing career, when Mom called crying. Dad had gotten lost driving to the grocery store, a route he'd taken 1,000 times. The diagnosis came 2 weeks later. Early-stage dementia, progressing faster than anyone expected. Mason, my older brother, lived in Seattle with his wife Grace and their twin boys. Successful software engineer, beautiful house, perfect life. When we had the family meeting about Dad's care, Mason was very clear about his position. I can't uproot my family, Abigail. The boys are settled in school, Grace has her job. You're single, you work remotely half the time anyway, it just makes sense. It just makes sense. Like my life was disposable. But I love Dad. Despite everything, despite him always bragging about Mason's achievements while barely acknowledging mine, despite the way he'd light up when Mason called, but treat my daily check-ins like interruptions, I loved him. So I packed my life into boxes, broke my lease, and moved back into my childhood bedroom. For 3 years, I became Dad's everything. I learned to manage his medications, 12 different pills at specific times. I drove him to every doctor's appointment, every therapy session. I held his hand through the bad nights when he couldn't remember where he was, when he called for Mom who'd been dead for 15 years. Mason visited twice a year, Christmas and Dad's birthday. He'd stay for a weekend, take some photos, post on Facebook about what a blessing family was, then disappear again. But here's what I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. While I was literally sacrificing my life to care for our father, Mason was slowly, systematically poisoning Dad against me. The funeral was on a Tuesday. Dad had passed peacefully in his sleep. I was holding his hand. The service was beautiful. People kept coming up to Mason, praising him for being such a devoted son. They'd glance at me with these looks of disappointment, like I was the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned her father. I didn't understand those looks then. I thought people were just confused. Maybe they didn't realize I'd been Dad's primary caregiver. I actually felt sorry for them, thinking they didn't know the full story. God, I was so naive. Friday afternoon, 3 days after we buried Dad, I sat in the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. It should have been simple. Dad had always said he'd split everything between Mason and me. The house, the business he'd built from nothing, his savings, everything he'd worked 60 years to accumulate. Joe Patterson, Dad's lawyer for 27 years, looked uncomfortable as he opened the folder. "This is unusual," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Your father made several changes to his will in the past 2 years. The most recent was just 6 months ago." He started reading, and with each word, my world crumbled. "To my son, Mason Thompson, who has shown unwavering love and support during my illness, I leave my house at 247 Maple Street, Thompson & Sons Construction Company, and the remainder of my estate, valued at approximately $800,000. I felt like I was drowning. The room started spinning. "To my daughter Abigail, I leave nothing. She has made it clear through her words and actions that she has no interest in family or in my well-being during my final years." No interest in family? I'd given up everything for him. Everything. But Joe wasn't done. He pressed play on a video Dad had recorded. There was my father, looking directly into the camera, his voice shaky but clear. "Abigail never calls unless she needs money. She never visits. I haven't seen her in over a year. She told Mason she didn't want to deal with an old man's problems. I'm heartbroken, but I won't leave my assets to someone who sees me as a burden." I ran out of that office and threw up in the parking lot. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Dad's words, but they didn't make sense. I lived in his house. I saw him every day. How could he think I never visited? That's when I remembered. Dad's computer was still in his study. Maybe there were clues there, something that would help me understand what happened to his mind in those final months. What I found was so much worse than dementia. I found emails, dozens of them. Messages that were supposedly from me to Mason, complaining about having to care for Dad. Messages like, "I can't deal with this anymore. He's getting worse, and I have my own life to live. You need to figure something else out." And messages supposedly from me directly to Dad. "I'm too busy with work to visit this week. Or next week. You'll be fine." Emails I never wrote. Conversations I never had. But the metadata told the real story. Every single fake email had been sent from Mason's IP address in Seattle. My hands were shaking as I kept digging. I found screenshots of text conversations between me and Dad, conversations where I allegedly called him a burden and said I couldn't wait for this to be over. Text conversations that never happened. Screenshots Mason had somehow fabricated. For 3 years, while I was living in Dad's house, feeding him breakfast every morning, reading him his favorite books, holding him when he cried for Mom, Mason was systematically creating a fictional narrative where I was the negligent, selfish daughter. The cruelest part? Dad's dementia made him forget I was there, but he remembered every lie Mason fed him. Each fake email, each fabricated text, each made-up story about my supposed abandonment that stuck in his failing mind while the reality of my daily presence faded away. I sat in Dad's study until dawn, printing everything, building my case, because Mason hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he'd stolen something infinitely more valuable. He'd stolen my father's love in his final years. He'd made sure Dad died thinking his daughter didn't care about him. And for that, Mason was going to pay. I spent 2 weeks preparing. I didn't just want to expose Mason, I wanted to destroy the false narrative he'd built so carefully. I gathered everything. The fake emails with their metadata, photos of me with Dad at every holiday Mason missed, Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, doctor's appointments, medical records showing I was listed as Dad's primary caregiver and emergency contact throughout his illness, bank statements proving I'd been paying for his groceries, medications, and home repairs with my own money. But the smoking gun was Dad's security system. He'd installed cameras throughout the house after a break-in scare 5 years earlier. Hours and hours of footage showing me reading to him, helping him with physical therapy, sleeping on the couch next to his chair when he was scared at night. And Mason's actual visits, brief, awkward 30-minute affairs where he mostly looked through Dad's papers and asked about important documents. I made a list of every person at Dad's funeral, his doctor, his neighbors, our extended family, Mason's coworkers who'd attended, Grace's parents who'd flown in from Denver, even Dad's physical therapist and the guy who delivered his groceries. I'd been collecting contact information for years, building a database for Dad's birthday cards and Christmas updates. Now I had a different use for it. The email's subject line was simple: the truth about my father's final years. I wrote 3 pages. I laid out everything with surgical precision. The fake emails, the fabricated texts, the systematic manipulation of a man with dementia. I attached photo after photo of me caring for Dad, medical documentation, financial records, security footage. And I ended with this. Mason Thompson spent 3 years systematically lying to our dying father, convincing him that his devoted daughter had abandoned him. While I lived in Dad's house as his full-time caregiver, Mason was in Seattle creating fake communications to ensure he would inherit everything. He didn't just steal my inheritance, he stole my father's love in his final years. He made sure Dad died thinking his daughter didn't care about him. I wanted you all to know the truth about the devoted son you praised at Dad's funeral. I sent it to 847 people at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday. By 6 a.m., my phone started ringing. Aunt Judy called first, sobbing. "Abigail, honey, we had no idea. We thought, God, what he did to you, what he did to your father." Dad's neighbor, Mrs. Ann, called next. "I always wondered why your father seemed so sad when you were right there taking such good care of him. Now I understand. That brother of yours should be ashamed." Then came the call that made it all worth it. Grace's mother, Luke's wife of 32 years, had received my email, and she immediately called Grace's father, who immediately called Mason at his office in Seattle and screamed at him for 20 minutes about what kind of monster manipulates a dying man with dementia. Grace's entire family had been at the funeral. They'd heard Mason's eulogy about being a devoted son, they'd seen him cry at the graveside, and now they knew it was all a performance. Within 6 hours, Mason had lost more than money. His wife's family, people who'd welcomed him into their lives, who'd trusted him with their daughter, who'd bragged about their son-in-law's character, now saw him for exactly what he was. His mother-in-law called him a sociopathic predator. His father-in-law threatened to fly to Seattle to have a conversation about honor. Grace called me that night, crying, "I don't know who the father of my children is. How could he do this to you? How could he do this to your dad?" Mason tried to call me once. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail that I deleted without listening to. His reputation was destroyed. The story spread through our hometown like wildfire. Dad's doctor was so disgusted he reported Mason to the State Bar Association. Apparently, interfering with an elderly person's medical care through deception is a serious crime. Mason's company received several calls from people who'd gotten my email. Professional consequences for personal actions. His co-workers now knew exactly who they'd been working alongside. But the sweetest justice was watching his perfect life crumble. Grace filed for separation 2 weeks later. She couldn't look at him, knowing what he'd done to a helpless old man with dementia. Her parents refused to let him in their house. Even his own sons started asking difficult questions about why Grandpa had died, thinking Aunt Abigail didn't love him. I didn't get Dad's house. I didn't get the business or the $800,000, but I got something infinitely more valuable. Everyone knew the truth. The whole town knew who really loved Dad, who sacrificed everything to care for him, who held his hand through the dark nights and celebrated his small victories during the hard days. And everyone knew what Mason really was, a predator who manipulated a dying man's deteriorating mind to steal an inheritance he never deserved. I sleep perfectly now. Dad died thinking I'd abandon him, and I can never fix that, but I made sure the whole world knows the truth about his precious son. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting what was stolen from you, it's making sure everyone knows who the real villain was. If this story resonated with you, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice served cold. Because sometimes, the truth is the most devastating weapon of all.